In Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society, Dr. A. Ahmed weaves a harrowing and provocative tale that plunges readers into the heart of cultural, religious, and personal conflict. Set against the stark contrasts between Western freedoms and the rigid traditions of a Muslim society, the novel follows Natasha, a woman whose very existence challenges the boundaries of legitimacy, faith, and survival. Through Natasha's journey from Canada to Sudan and beyond, the story exposes the raw realities faced by women trapped between oppressive customs and their own yearning for dignity and justice. With unflinching honesty, Ahmed explores themes of love, resilience, and sacrifice, while daring to confront the misogynistic practices and taboos that shape and often shatter lives. This is not just a story of one woman's struggle, but a sweeping epic that resonates with the voices of countless others silenced by tradition, law, and fear. This is the story of Natasha, a woman born into shame, raised in exile, and thrust into a world where every breath is a defiance of fate. In the pages of Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society, Dr. A. Ahmed invites us to walk beside a heroine whose life is marked by heartbreak, courage, and the relentless search for dignity. Natasha's journey is not just a passage across continents, but a desperate struggle for survival in societies that brand her existence as a crime. Through her eyes, we witness the agony of rejection, the terror of violence, and the fragile hope that flickers even in the darkest moments. This novel is a cry for justice and a testament to the unbreakable spirit of women who, despite being silenced and scarred, dare to love, to resist, and to dream of freedom. Prepare to be moved, outraged, and forever changed by Natasha's unforgettable story. Natasha is a woman forged in the fires of adversity, a child born into stigma, raised in exile, and forced to navigate the perilous boundaries of identity, faith, and survival. Marked from birth as illegitimate, Natasha's life is a relentless struggle against the crushing weight of tradition and the cruelty of those who see her as a living shame. Yet, beneath the scars of rejection and violence, she possesses a fierce intelligence, a compassionate heart, and an unbreakable will. Natasha's journey from the safety of Canada to the dangers of Sudan and beyond is a testament to her resilience and her refusal to be silenced. She is both witness and survivor, a seeker of truth who dares to challenge the injustices that have defined her world. Through every heartbreak and betrayal, Natasha clings to hope, determined to carve out a life of dignity for herself and her child, and to shine a light on the hidden suffering of countless women like her, each linked to Natasha's journey. 1. Identity and belonging. Natasha's life is shaped by her status as an illegitimate child, forcing her to navigate a world that constantly questions her right to exist. Her struggle to find acceptance within her family, her faith, and society underscores the pain and resilience of those born on the margins. 2. Gender and oppression. The novel exposes the harsh realities faced by women in patriarchal and religiously conservative societies. Natasha's experiences, ranging from enforced dress codes and restricted freedoms to the threat of violence and honor-based punishment, highlight the systemic misogyny that governs the lives of countless women. 3. Survival and resistance. Despite relentless adversity, Natasha's story is one of survival. Her courage to speak out, to seek justice, and to protect her child becomes an act of resistance against the forces that seek to silence her. 4. Family, shame, and forgiveness. Family is both a source of pain and hope for Natasha. The novel explores the devastating impact of shame, secrecy, and betrayal, but also the possibility of forgiveness and reconciliation, even when wounds run deep. 5. Faith, doubt, and transformation. Natasha's journey is marked by spiritual questioning and transformation. Her encounters with religious dogma, hypocrisy, and personal faith challenge her to define her own beliefs and values, ultimately seeking meaning beyond inherited traditions. 6. The power of storytelling. By sharing her truth, Natasha becomes a voice for the voiceless. The novel itself is a call to break the silence around taboo subjects, such as illegitimacy, sexual violence, and women's rights, and to inspire empathy, dialogue, and change. 7. Hope and the possibility of change. Amidst suffering and injustice, Natasha's story is ultimately hopeful. Her resilience and determination to create a better future for herself and her child embody the belief that change is possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. These themes are woven throughout Natasha's journey, making her story both deeply personal and universally resonant. Natasha's character arc is a journey from vulnerability and shame to resilience and self-empowerment. Born as an illegitimate child and raised in exile, Natasha's early life is marked by stigma, secrecy, and a desperate longing for acceptance. Her initial experiences are defined by fear, rejection, and the constant threat of violence, both from her family and the society that brands her existence as a crime. As she is thrust into the harsh realities of a patriarchal and religiously rigid world, Natasha's spirit is tested by trauma, betrayal, and unimaginable suffering, including sexual violence and the loss of loved ones. Despite these hardships, Natasha's inner strength begins to emerge. She refuses to be defined by the shame imposed upon her, and instead seeks knowledge, education, and the power of her own voice. Her journey from Sudan to Canada and back again is not just a physical migration, but a transformation of identity and purpose. Natasha evolves from a passive victim to an active witness and advocate, determined to expose the injustices faced by women like herself. Through acts of courage, whether protecting her child, challenging oppressive customs, or speaking out against abuse, she reclaims her agency and dignity. Natasha's development is also marked by her struggle with faith, belonging, and forgiveness. She confronts the complexities of her own heritage, the pain of familial betrayal, and the challenge of building new relationships in the aftermath of trauma. Ultimately, Natasha's story is one of hope and healing. She becomes a symbol of resilience, using her experiences to inspire change, advocate for women's rights, and break the silence surrounding taboo subjects. By the end of the novel, Natasha stands not only as a survivor, but as a powerful voice for justice and transformation, embodying the possibility of new beginnings even after the deepest wounds. Key challenges. Stigma of illegitimacy. Natasha is born as an illegitimate child, carrying the burden of shame and rejection from her family and society from the very beginning of her life. Cultural and religious oppression. She faces severe restrictions and dangers as a woman in conservative Muslim societies, including threats of violence, legal discrimination, and the constant risk of being punished for simply existing outside prescribed norms. Sexual violence and betrayal. Natasha endures sexual assault, including rape by authority figures and even her own biological father, compounding her trauma and sense of isolation. Loss and exile. She is repeatedly uprooted, forced to leave her home, separated from loved ones, and denied a sense of belonging both in Sudan and in Canada. Family tragedies. Natasha's life is marked by the violent deaths of family members, honor killings, and the pain of discovering hidden truths about her origins and relationships. Struggles for justice and voice. She is silenced, disbelieved, and even persecuted for seeking justice, telling her story and advocating for women's rights. Turning points. Journey to Sudan. Natasha's decision to travel from Canada to Sudan marks a pivotal moment, exposing her to the harsh realities of her heritage and the dangers awaiting her as a woman alone. Surviving imprisonment and abuse, her arrest, torture, and eventual release from Sudanese prison become a crucible, forging her resilience and deepening her commitment to exposing injustice. Academic and personal awakening. Natasha channels her suffering into academic research and activism, using her experiences to write, speak, and challenge oppressive systems. Acts of defiance and advocacy. She chooses to make her story public, risking her safety to become a voice for silenced women, and ignites international attention and debate. Confronting family secrets. Natasha's discovery of her true parentage, her unwitting incestuous relationships, and the crimes of her father force her to confront the deepest wounds of her past. Choosing hope and healing, despite relentless adversity, Natasha ultimately chooses to fight for her own dignity and that of her children, seeking healing, reconciliation, and a future defined not by shame, but by courage and hope. These challenges and turning points shape Natasha's journey from victimhood to agency, making her story both heartrending and inspiring. Main characters: Natasha Shamsaldeen, the central protagonist, born as an illegitimate child, whose journey from Canada to Sudan and beyond exposes her to stigma, violence, and, ultimately, resilience and activism.
Waïd Mohamed Ahmed.
Natasha's brother, who shares a complex and tragic relationship with her, including an unwitting incestuous marriage and fatherhood of her first child. Sheikh Yasser Sefaldeen, also known as Yasser Saif al-Dowla. Natasha's biological father, a controversial religious leader with a dark and abusive past, whose actions cast a long shadow over Natasha's life.
Duria Nur al-Huda.
Natasha's mother-in-law and the mother of Hassan, a staunch Muslim woman whose presence brings further conflict and tension into Natasha's life. Dr.
Hassan Yasir Saif al-Dowla.
Natasha's second husband and half-brother, a Sudanese doctor whose relationship with Natasha is marked by love, betrayal, and the revelation of their true blood ties.
Siham Nazi Saif al-Dowla.
Hassan's first wife, whose tragic fate, stoning for adultery, becomes a pivotal event in the novel.
Ilham Salah.
Hassan's secret second Muslim wife in Canada, whose relationship with Hassan leads to legal and personal turmoil. Almaz Abraha, Wahid's Ethiopian wife and Natasha's close friend, who provides support and stability for Natasha and her children. Nadia, Sami, and Wahid, children. Natasha's children, each born under complex and painful circumstances, representing both her suffering and her hope for the future. These characters, along with a host of extended family members, religious authorities, and community figures, shape the intricate and emotionally charged world of Natasha's story. Natasha, born as an illegitimate child in a conservative Muslim society, is marked from birth by stigma and rejection. Raised in exile and haunted by her family's tragic past, she journeys from Canada to Sudan in search of identity, belonging, and answers about her origins. In Sudan, Natasha is confronted by the harsh realities of gender oppression, religious law, and cultural taboos. She endures arrest, sexual violence, and the constant threat of punishment for simply existing outside the bounds of tradition. Her resilience is tested as she survives imprisonment, betrayal, and the loss of loved ones to honor killings and injustice. Returning to Canada, Natasha transforms her suffering into activism, becoming a powerful voice for women's rights and exposing the hidden abuses faced by countless others. Along the way, she uncovers devastating family secrets, including unwitting incestuous relationships and the crimes of her biological father, that force her to confront the deepest wounds of her past. Despite relentless adversity, Natasha's journey is ultimately one of survival, hope, and the unbreakable human spirit, as she fights to create a life of dignity for herself and her children, and to inspire change in a world that would silence her. Natasha finds everything shockingly different upon her first arrival in Sudan because she is suddenly immersed in a society governed by strict religious laws and social customs that are foreign and often oppressive compared to her life in Canada. The moment she lands, she is confronted by a world where gender segregation is enforced, women's dress and behavior are tightly controlled, and even basic freedoms she took for granted are denied. Immediate challenges Natasha faces in Khartoum include inability to move freely. As a single woman traveling alone, Natasha is not allowed to take a taxi from the airport or check into a hotel without a male relative, a mahram, accompanying her. She is repeatedly denied accommodation and transportation, facing suspicion and legal barriers at every turn. Legal and social suspicion. The authorities and hotel staff view her presence as suspicious and potentially criminal simply because she is unaccompanied by a male guardian. She is warned that being alone could lead to arrest or accusations of immoral behavior. Cultural alienation. Natasha is forced to change her clothing and behavior to conform to local expectations, including wearing a hijab and jilbab, and is warned against bringing a Bible or expressing her Christian faith, which could put her at risk of severe punishment. Vulnerability and isolation. She quickly realizes that, as a woman alone, she is extremely vulnerable, not only to legal repercussions, but also to harassment and exploitation. Even when she tries to travel onward by bus, she is told she must buy 2 tickets to avoid sitting next to a man and is subjected to the stares and judgment of male passengers. Loss of agency. Natasha's lack of local connections, her unfamiliarity with the language and customs, and the loss of her identification and money when her handbag is stolen, leave her powerless and at the mercy of a system designed to control and intimidate women. These immediate challenges set the stage for Natasha's struggle for survival and dignity in a society that sees her as both an outsider and a threat. Natasha employs several coping strategies to survive the immediate and overwhelming challenges she faces upon arriving in Khartoum. Adapting her appearance and behavior. Natasha quickly realizes that her Western clothing and mannerisms make her a target for suspicion and danger. She changes into a hijab and jilbab before even arriving in Sudan and consciously suppresses her natural behaviors, such as speaking openly or moving freely, to avoid drawing attention or provoking authorities. Seeking help from strangers. When denied accommodation and transportation due to her lack of a male guardian, Natasha accepts help from a sympathetic Western couple at the airport. She relies on their kindness to navigate the city and find temporary solutions, showing her willingness to trust and accept support when necessary. Problem-solving and persistence. Despite repeated rejections at hotels and guest houses, Natasha persists in searching for a place to stay, asking questions, and exploring every possible option. When all doors are closed, she adapts her plans and decides to travel onward to her relative's city, demonstrating resourcefulness and determination. Maintaining caution and discretion. Natasha is acutely aware of the risks associated with her identity and background. She hides her Christian faith, avoids carrying a Bible, and is careful not to reveal personal details that could endanger her. She also follows local advice about what not to do or wear, even when it feels restrictive or demeaning. Emotional regulation and inner strength. Although Natasha feels fear, isolation, and anxiety, she does not allow herself to panic. She draws on her inner resilience, reminding herself of her purpose and the need to stay calm in order to survive. Even when her handbag is stolen and she loses her documents and money, she tries to reason with authorities and fellow passengers and continues to seek solutions rather than giving in to despair. Strategic compliance. Natasha complies with local laws and customs, even when they feel unjust, as a means of self-preservation. She buys 2 bus tickets to avoid sitting next to a man and submits to identity checks and questioning, understanding that resistance could lead to arrest or worse. Through these coping strategies, Natasha demonstrates adaptability, courage, and a refusal to give up, even when faced with overwhelming odds in an unfamiliar and hostile environment. The construction of a traditional Muslim house is described as a reflection of strict gender segregation and religious customs. Every Muslim house is typically divided into 2 distinct sections, one for men and one for women. This division is as absolute as the separation between public washrooms for men and women. The 2 sections are separated by a solid partition, sometimes compared to the Iron Wall of Berlin or the Great Wall of China, making them feel like 2 separate houses within one structure. In the middle of the partition, there is usually a small door, which only the father or brothers are permitted to open and use. Women are strictly forbidden, at any time and under any circumstances, from crossing into the men's section. Each section has its own entrance, rooms, furniture, toilet, and bathroom. The women's section also includes a kitchen, as it is considered a great shame for a man to cook or even make tea in this society. Bathrooms are also divided by function. One is used exclusively for bathing and religious ablution, while the toilet is used solely for relieving oneself. The design and use of space in the house are believed to be divinely ordained, based on the teachings of the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad, and are strictly observed by Muslims wherever they live. This architectural and social arrangement is intended to enforce modesty, privacy, and the separation of genders, and is seen as a fundamental aspect of daily life in many traditional Muslim societies. Natasha is arrested by the highway police because, after a long and exhausting journey from Canada to Sudan, she is mistaken for an Eritrean or Ethiopian refugee who has escaped from a refugee camp without official permission. While traveling alone on a bus to her relative's city, Natasha's handbag containing her passport, visa, and all identification gets stolen while she is sleeping. When the police board the bus for a routine check and ask for her documents, she is unable to provide any proof of her identity or legal status. Due to her accent, appearance, and lack of papers, the police suspect she is a runaway refugee rather than a Canadian visitor. Despite her attempts to explain her situation, the police do not believe her and accuse her of lying. As a result, Natasha is forced off the bus and placed under arrest, beginning a harrowing ordeal in police detention. Her ordeal intensifies dramatically. Mistaken for an Eritrean or Ethiopian refugee who has escaped from a camp without permission, Natasha is taken into custody and placed in a solitary highway police checkpoint. Inside the detention room, she finds herself with two other young Ethiopian girls who, like her, have been detained for traveling without official permits. Natasha tries to communicate with the girls and learns of their own harrowing experiences, stories of abuse, beatings, and sexual violence at the hands of police and military men. Despite Natasha's attempts to explain her true identity as a Canadian visitor, the police do not believe her, especially since her accent and appearance make her seem foreign, and she has no documents to prove otherwise. During her detention, Natasha is subjected to harsh interrogation and physical abuse. The police, convinced she is lying, beat her and treat her as a runaway refugee. At night, the situation becomes even more dire. The two Ethiopian girls are sexually assaulted by the policemen, and Natasha herself is brutally raped by the officers the following night. The next day, the police drive her to the city she had originally intended to reach, mocking her threats to report their crimes and telling her she will never be able to prove anything against them. This traumatic episode leaves Natasha physically and emotionally scarred, deepening her sense of vulnerability and injustice, but also fueling her determination to survive and eventually seek justice for herself and other women subjected to similar abuses. After the assault by the police officers, Natasha's emotional state is one of profound trauma, fear, and devastation. She is left feeling violated, powerless, and deeply isolated. The brutality of the experience shatters any remaining sense of safety she might have had, intensifying her feelings of vulnerability in a society that already treats her as an outsider and a threat. Natasha is overwhelmed by a sense of shame and helplessness, knowing that the very authorities meant to protect her have become her abusers, and that seeking justice is nearly impossible in a system stacked against women like her. Emotionally, Natasha is caught between shock and numbness, struggling to process the violence inflicted upon her. She is haunted by the knowledge that her suffering will likely be dismissed or disbelieved, and that speaking out could bring further danger or humiliation. Despite this, the experience also plants the seeds of resilience and determination within her, fueling her later resolve to survive, seek dignity, and eventually expose the injustices faced by women in similar circumstances. After the assault, Natasha's support systems are limited, but gradually begin to form as she seeks safety and a sense of belonging. Initially, she finds herself isolated and unable to trust authorities, given that her abusers were police officers. However, as she moves forward, Natasha receives crucial support from a few key sources. Female relatives and friends. When Natasha finally reaches her relatives in Sudan, she is taken in by an older woman and her daughter-in-law. Though their initial acceptance is cautious, they provide her with shelter, companionship, and a measure of stability. Over time, Natasha forms bonds with these women and their neighbors, finding comfort in their shared experiences and daily routines. Her brother in Canada. Natasha is able to contact her brother Wahid in Canada, who becomes a vital emotional and financial support. He listens to her story, expresses outrage at her suffering, and sends her money to help her survive in Sudan. His encouragement and belief in her give Natasha strength to endure and consider seeking justice. Other victims. Natasha also connects with other women who have suffered similar abuses, such as the Ethiopian and Eritrean refugee girls she meets in detention. Their shared stories of hardship and survival create a sense of solidarity and mutual understanding, helping Natasha realize she is not alone in her pain. Her own resilience. Perhaps most importantly, Natasha draws on her inner strength and determination to survive. Despite her trauma, she refuses to give up, using her experiences as motivation to advocate for herself and, eventually, for other women facing similar injustices. While Natasha's support systems are fragile and sometimes imperfect, they play a crucial role in her journey toward healing, justice, and reclaiming her dignity. The structure of the traditional Muslim house has a profound impact on Natasha's experiences and sense of self. The strict division of the home into separate men's and women's sections, enforced by physical barriers and social rules, immediately makes Natasha feel confined and isolated. She is not allowed to move freely within the house, and her access to certain spaces is tightly controlled by male authority figures. This architectural separation reinforces her feelings of exclusion and powerlessness, mirroring the broader gender segregation and restrictions she faces in society. For Natasha, the house is not a sanctuary, but another site of surveillance and limitation. The inability to cross into the men's section without permission, the expectation to remain within the women's quarters, and the constant policing of her movements and behavior all contribute to her sense of being trapped. The house's structure becomes a daily reminder of her lack of autonomy and the deep-rooted cultural norms that dictate her role and value as a woman. This environment intensifies her emotional struggle, fueling both her frustration and her determination to seek dignity and freedom despite the walls, both literal and figurative, that surround her. Natasha's interactions with male family members are shaped by the strict patriarchal norms and gender segregation of the society she enters. From the outset, Natasha is acutely aware that her movements, choices, and even her presence are subject to the authority and scrutiny of male relatives. When she arrives in Sudan, Natasha finds that she cannot move freely or make decisions independently. She is expected to be accompanied by a male guardian, such as a father, brother, or grown-up son at all times. Male family members hold the power to grant or deny her access to certain spaces, including parts of the family home, and are responsible for enforcing the rules that govern her behavior and appearance. This dynamic is not just social, but also legal. Men are authorized to represent, protect, and discipline female relatives, and their word carries more weight in matters of family honor and public conduct. Natasha's interactions with male relatives are often marked by tension, misunderstanding, and a sense of powerlessness. She is frequently questioned, judged, or even threatened by male family members who see her as a potential source of shame or dishonor. At times, these interactions become confrontational or even abusive, especially when Natasha's actions or background challenge the family's reputation or the community's expectations. Despite these challenges, Natasha sometimes seeks support or protection from male relatives when she has no other options, highlighting the complexity and ambivalence of these relationships. Overall, Natasha's experiences with male family members underscore the broader themes of control, surveillance, and the struggle for autonomy that define her journey throughout the novel. Natasha's interaction with the polygamous home, a household consisting of one husband, 3 wives, and their many children, is both eye-opening and deeply unsettling for her. Upon moving in with her relatives, Natasha is introduced to the neighboring family, which at first appears to be several families living together, but is, in fact, a single polygamous household. Natasha is struck by the sheer size and complexity of the family. The husband has 3 wives and 21 children, all living under one roof. The wives are rivals, and their relationships are marked by frequent quarrels, jealousy, and even physical fights, often triggered by disputes among their children. Natasha observes that the wives have little autonomy or security, and their daily lives are dominated by competition for the husband's attention and resources. She is both fascinated and disturbed by the rituals and self-mortification the wives undergo to prepare themselves for their husband, such as painful hair removal and body smoking with sandalwood, practices believed to make them more desirable. Natasha notes that these customs, along with the constant rivalry and lack of individual rights, contribute to the emotional and psychological suffering of the women and children in the household. Through her close observation and growing friendship with the wives, Natasha gains first-hand insight into the consequences of polygamy, the confusion and neglect experienced by the children, the erosion of solidarity among women, and the normalization of jealousy and competition. She comes to see polygamy as a powerful tool of control and abuse, perpetuating the subjugation of women and undermining their well-being. This experience profoundly shapes Natasha's understanding of gender roles and fuels her determination to document and challenge the injustices faced by women in such environments. Natasha's observations of the wives' daily lives in the polygamous household are detailed, empathetic, and often unsettling. She notices that the 3 wives live in a constant state of rivalry and tension, with daily life marked by frequent quarrels, often sparked by disputes among their many children, which sometimes escalate into physical fights. Natasha is struck by how the wives' identities and roles are shaped by their relationship to the husband and to each other, rather than by their own individuality or desires. She observes that the wives have little privacy or autonomy. Their days are filled with domestic labor, child-rearing, and the emotional strain of competing for the husband's attention and resources. Natasha is particularly affected by the elaborate and painful beauty rituals the wives undergo to prepare for their nights with the husband, such as removing body hair with homemade halwa, a mixture of sugar, water, and lemon, and smoking their bodies with sandalwood, a process believed to make them more attractive and to tighten their genitally mutilated bodies. These rituals are not only physically painful, but also emotionally taxing, reinforcing the idea that a woman's worth is tied to her ability to please her husband. Natasha notes that the wives' relationships with each other are fraught with jealousy and suspicion, but also moments of reluctant solidarity, especially when dealing with the challenges of raising children in such a crowded and competitive environment. She sees how the children themselves are affected, often confused, neglected, or caught in the crossfire of their mother's disputes. Through her observations, Natasha concludes that polygamy in this context is a source of suffering for both women and children. It fosters insecurity, rivalry, and emotional deprivation, while reinforcing the husband's authority and control. The wives' daily lives, as Natasha witnesses, are a testament to their endurance, but also a powerful illustration of the deep costs of a system that denies women autonomy and equality. Natasha's relationship with each of the 3 wives in the polygamous household is complex and evolves as she spends time observing and interacting with them. The first wife, Natasha initially sees the first wife as the most senior and authoritative among the 3. This wife often takes on the role of mediator or judge during disputes between the other wives and their children. Natasha senses a certain weariness in her, as she has endured the longest in the marriage and bears the brunt of the household's emotional labor. Despite her authority, the first wife is also vulnerable to jealousy and rivalry, especially as she ages and feels her influence wane. The second wife, Natasha finds the second wife to be more openly competitive and sometimes combative. This wife is often at the center of quarrels, both with the other wives and in defense of her own children. Natasha observes that the second wife is quick to assert her rights and is deeply affected by the constant struggle for the husband's attention. Through conversations and daily interactions, Natasha comes to understand the emotional toll that polygamy takes on her, fueling both resentment and moments of reluctant solidarity with the other wives. The third youngest wife, Natasha is particularly struck by the youngest wife's position. She is often favored by the husband due to her youth and beauty, which makes her a target of envy and suspicion from the others. Natasha notices that the youngest wife is under immense pressure to maintain her attractiveness and fulfill the husband's desires, leading her to endure the most painful beauty rituals. Natasha feels empathy for her, recognizing that her apparent privilege comes with its own burdens of isolation and expectation. With all three wives, Natasha's relationship is shaped by a mix of curiosity, empathy, and growing friendship. She listens to their stories, helps with their children, and becomes a confidant, especially as she documents their daily struggles for her research. Over time, Natasha's presence becomes a catalyst for the wives to reflect on their own situations, and she witnesses moments of both rivalry and rare unity among them. Her interactions with the wives deepen her understanding of the emotional and psychological costs of polygamy and strengthen her resolve to advocate for women's dignity and rights. Here is a scene inspired by Natasha and her illegitimate child in a Muslim society by Dr. A. Ahmed, showing Natasha in conversation with the second wife in the polygamous household. Natasha found the second wife, Fatima, sitting on a low stool in the kitchen, her hands deep in a bowl of dough. The air was thick with the scent of yeast and wood smoke. Natasha hesitated at the doorway, uncertain if she was intruding. Fatima glanced up, her eyes tired but curious. "Come in, Natasha. You look lost." Natasha managed a small smile and stepped inside. "I just wanted to see if you needed help." Fatima shrugged, kneading the dough with practiced strength. "There is always work. But you are a guest. You should rest." Natasha shook her head. "I'd rather be useful. Besides, I want to learn. Everything here is so different from what I knew in Canada." Fatima's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Different, yes. Here, a woman's life is measured by the bread she bakes, the children she raises, and the patience she keeps." Natasha sat beside her, watching the rhythmic motion of Fatima's hands. "Is it hard? Sharing your husband, your home?" Fatima's hands stilled. For a moment, she seemed to weigh her words. "Hard? Some days, I think I will go mad from jealousy or anger. Other days, I am too tired to care. We fight, we make peace, and tomorrow it starts again. But what choice do we have? This is our life." Natasha's voice was gentle. "Do you ever wish for something else?" Fatima looked at her, eyes shining with unshed tears. "Of course. But wishing does not change anything. Here, a woman's wishes are like dust, swept away by the wind." Natasha reached out, placing her hand over Fatima's flour-dusted fingers. "I'm sorry. I wish I could help." Fatima squeezed her hand, a brief moment of solidarity. "You help by listening. Most days, no one listens." For a while, they sat together in the quiet kitchen, two women from different worlds, bound by the silent understanding of what it means to endure. This scene captures Natasha's empathy, her desire to understand, and the emotional reality of the wives' daily lives in the polygamous household. Natasha's responses to female genital mutilation, FGM, in Sudan are deeply emotional, critical, and transformative. 1. Shock and outrage. When Natasha first learns that one of the wives in the polygamous household is planning to circumcise her young daughter, she is horrified. She tries to convince the mother not to go through with the procedure, explaining that FGM is harmful and not beneficial. However, the mother is adamant, citing religious and cultural justifications, and lectures Natasha on the supposed necessity of the practice. Natasha is deeply troubled by the mother's belief that an uncircumcised girl will become wild and bring shame to her family. First-hand witness to trauma. Despite her efforts, Natasha is unable to prevent the circumcision and forces herself to attend the procedure as part of her fieldwork. She witnesses the brutal, non-medical operation performed on a 4-year-old girl. The child is tied up, Her clitoris and labia are cut away with a razor, and the wound is sealed, leaving only a tiny hole. Natasha is traumatized by the child's screams, the blood, and the pain inflicted, describing it as the most brutal operation she has ever seen. The experience leaves her shuddering and terrified whenever she recalls it. Anger at justifications and denial. Natasha is angered by the religious and cultural justifications for FGM, especially when she hears local women and even some Western-educated feminists claim that the practice is not Islamic or is merely an African custom. She points out that there are authentic hadiths cited to justify FGM and is frustrated that these justifications are used to perpetuate the practice. Natasha is also critical of Muslim feminists who, in her view, deny or minimize the connection between FGM and Islamic teachings, arguing that such denial allows the abuse to continue. Moral and academic resolve. After witnessing the operation, Natasha considers abandoning her research and returning to Canada, feeling overwhelmed by the cruelty she has seen. However, she ultimately decides to stay, believing it is her duty to bear witness and later expose these practices to the world. She is motivated by a sense of responsibility to the victims and a desire to inspire change by documenting and publicizing the realities faced by women and girls in Sudan. Advocacy and call for change. Natasha's experience with FGM becomes a catalyst for her activism. She uses her academic work and later her public advocacy to challenge the silence and denial around FGM, calling for international condemnation and legal bans on the practice. She argues that only external pressure and legal enforcement can protect girls from such harm, as internal reform is often blocked by religious and cultural resistance. Natasha's response to female genital mutilation in Sudan is one of horror, empathy for the victims, anger at the justifications and denial, and a strengthened resolve to expose and fight against the practice through her research and advocacy. Here are direct quotes and an analysis of how Natasha's experiences with female genital mutilation, FGM, in Sudan shape her character and later activism. Direct quotes from the novel. On witnessing FGM. As part of her fieldwork, Natasha forced herself to attend that painful operation. The woman has subjected the 4-year-old girl to the most brutal operation Natasha had ever seen in her life. The little girl has been tied with the ropes through hands and legs. The circumciser began to examine the private parts of the child. She used wet cloths to clean up the tiny vagina of the small girl. Then she began to cut off the child's clitoris and slice her labia majora and labia minora. The child fainted before the stitching of her 2 labias is completed. Natasha always shudders and terrifies whenever she remembers that primitive, barbaric, and painful operation of female genital mutilation. Response. After witnessing that inhumane operation, Natasha decided to return to her country and forget about doing any further fieldwork among those backward and primitive people. She has somehow restrained her emotions and stayed behind. She understood that if she runs away from those horrifying experiences, she will abandon those poor children and those victimized women. She felt it was her duty and divine calling to witness those evil practices and later expose them and let the entire world know about them. On the justifications for FGM. What troubled Natasha and made her exceedingly angry is the primitive and cruel way that operation has been performed by a circumciser who has nothing to do with medical knowledge and the surgeon's experience. Natasha tried to convince the mother that what she intended to do to her daughter would harm her rather than benefit her. The woman is shocked when she heard that female genital mutilation harms her daughter and not good for her. Therefore, she lectured the uncircumcised Western girl Natasha on the many benefits of female genital mutilation and the danger of having an uncircumcised daughter. On the broader silence and denial. After witnessing that cruel and evil operation, Natasha wondered why the feminists in the West do not speak or condemn such evil practices. Why do the Muslim feminists always try to deny and hide those practices and falsely claim they have nothing to do with Islam? Natasha understood that the feminists' fallacious arguments are harmful to those Muslim children and women who experience those evil practices in their Muslim countries. Analysis. How these experiences shape Natasha's character and activism. 1. Deepening empathy and moral outrage. Natasha's direct exposure to the suffering of girls subjected to FGM profoundly affects her. The trauma she witnesses instills in her a sense of empathy and a moral imperative to act. Her horror and anger at the justifications for FGM, especially when cloaked in religious or cultural authority, fuel her determination to speak out. 2. Strengthening resolve and sense of duty. Although Natasha initially considers abandoning her research due to the emotional toll, she ultimately decides to stay. This decision marks a turning point. She recognizes that bearing witness and documenting these abuses is not just academic work, but a moral responsibility. This sense of duty becomes a core part of her identity and later activism. 3. Motivating advocacy and public exposure. Natasha's experiences with FGM become a catalyst for her activism. She is driven to expose the realities of FGM and other abuses against women, both in her academic work and in public advocacy. She challenges the silence and denial around FGM, especially among those who claim it is not connected to religion or who minimize its harm. 4. Shaping her critique of cultural and religious justifications. The resistance she encounters from mothers, community members, and even some Western feminists shapes Natasha's critique of how harmful practices are perpetuated and justified. She becomes more critical of both internal and external actors who deny or excuse FGM, arguing that such denial enables continued abuse. 5. Inspiring calls for international action. Natasha concludes that only external pressure and legal enforcement can protect girls from FGM, as internal reform is often blocked by entrenched cultural and religious resistance. Her advocacy extends beyond Sudan, calling for international condemnation and legal bans on FGM and similar practices. In summary, Natasha's first-hand experiences with FGM in Sudan are pivotal in transforming her from a researcher into an activist. The trauma she witnesses, the resistance she faces, and the silence she observes among both local and international actors all contribute to her resolve to expose and fight against FGM and other forms of gender-based violence. For inclusion in your essay. FGM Case Study Summary. During her fieldwork in Sudan, Natasha directly encounters the practice of female genital mutilation, FGM, when a mother in the polygamous household where she is staying decides to have her young daughter circumcised. Despite Natasha's attempts to persuade the mother not to proceed, explaining the harm and lack of benefit, the mother insists, citing religious and cultural reasons. Natasha is shocked by the mother's belief that uncircumcised girls will become wild and bring shame to their families. Natasha witnesses the procedure firsthand. The 4-year-old girl is tied up, her clitoris and labia are cut away with a razor, and the wound is sealed, leaving only a tiny hole. The operation is performed by an untrained, illiterate woman using primitive tools, with no anesthesia. The child screams in pain and eventually faints. Natasha is traumatized by the brutality, describing it as the most horrific operation she has ever seen. The experience leaves her shuddering and haunted by the memory. After witnessing the FGM, Natasha is so disturbed that she considers abandoning her research and returning to Canada. However, she ultimately decides to stay, feeling a moral responsibility to bear witness and later expose these abuses to the world. She is angered by the religious and cultural justifications for FGM, as well as by the denial or minimization of its connection to Islam by some local women and Western feminists. Natasha concludes that such denial perpetuates harm and that only external pressure and legal enforcement can protect girls from FGM. Study becomes a turning point for Natasha, strengthening her resolve to document and speak out against FGM and other forms of gender-based violence, and shaping her later activism and advocacy for women's rights. Connecting FGM to gender oppression. The case study of female genital mutilation, FGM, in the novel is a powerful illustration of gender oppression as it is practiced and perpetuated in Sudanese society. FGM is not portrayed as an isolated act of violence, but as part of a larger system designed to control and subjugate women from childhood onward. 1. FGM as a mechanism of control. The procedure is justified by mothers and elders as necessary to ensure a girl's purity, obedience, and marriageability. This reflects a broader societal belief that a woman's value is tied to her sexual behavior and her conformity to patriarchal expectations. Natasha observes that FGM is enforced by both men and women, showing how patriarchal norms are internalized and perpetuated by the very people they oppress. Natasha and her Illegitimate. The novel details how FGM is defended using religious texts and cultural traditions, and how questioning the practice is met with shock or hostility. This mirrors the way other forms of gender oppression, such as enforced dress codes, restricted movement, and honor-based violence, are also justified in the name of religion or tradition. 3. Silencing and shame. The secrecy and taboo surrounding FGM reinforce the broader culture of silence around women's suffering. Natasha's attempts to speak out are met with denial or minimization, both by local women and by some Western feminists, highlighting how silence and shame are used to maintain the status quo. 4. Trauma and resistance. The trauma Natasha witnesses and the trauma inflicted on the girls serves as a microcosm of the violence and suffering experienced by women under patriarchal systems. Natasha's horror and outrage at FGM become a catalyst for her activism, mirroring the journeys of other women in the novel who resist or survive gender-based violence. 5. FGM as part of a web of oppression. The novel makes clear that FGM is just one aspect of a much larger web of gender oppression, which includes polygamy, child marriage, wife-beating, and the denial of women's autonomy. Natasha's fight against FGM becomes symbolic of her broader struggle against all forms of misogyny and abuse sanctioned by law, religion, and custom. In summary, FGM in the novel is not just a physical act, but a symbol and instrument of gender oppression. It is deeply connected to the ways in which women's bodies, choices, and voices are controlled, and it exemplifies the intersection of tradition, religion, and power in maintaining patriarchal dominance. Natasha's response to FGM and her determination to expose and challenge it reflects the novel's larger message about the necessity of confronting and dismantling systems of gender-based oppression. Natasha's reaction to the news of the child marriage of one of the daughters of the polygamist husband is one of shock, outrage, and deep moral disturbance. When Natasha learns that a 12-year-old daughter of the first wife is engaged to her 25-year-old male cousin and will soon be married, she is appalled. She immediately voices her concern to her friend Shama, stating that the girl is still a child. Shama, however, tries to justify the marriage by saying the girl has already begun to menstruate and is therefore considered an adult by local standards. Shama even adds that the girl is physically able to carry it, meaning she can physically accommodate her future husband's sexual advances, referencing her own experience of being married at 13. Natasha is deeply disturbed by this justification and rebukes Shama for what she sees as a stupid analogy and silly justification. When Shama further explains that, according to Sharia law and the example of the Prophet Muhammad, a girl becomes marriageable at the age of 9, Natasha becomes extremely angry. She realizes that if she openly rejects this teaching, she might be accused of being an apostate. Instead, she tries to talk to Haja Fatima, another elder woman, to convince her to intervene. Haja Fatima, however, repeats the common religious justification, citing the Prophet's marriage to Aisha at a young age. Natasha's reaction is described as follows. Natasha became extremely mad with Shama. She understood that if she rejects the teaching of the Sharia, she might be accused of not being a true Muslim or an apostate girl. She ignored Shama and talked to Haja Fatima about the serious matter and tried to convince her to talk to the mother of the underage girl. Haja Fatima quoted for her the common story which Muslims always use to justify pedophilia. The Prophet Muhammad married our mother Aisha when she was 6-year-old and slept with her when she was 9-year-old. Natasha understood the door of protesting was shut in her face. This serious matter is so disturbing and torturing her conscience. More disturbing, than the act of marrying and raping a child is the fact that Muslims today defend the practice of pedophilia and find the religious authority to back up their defense. Since, as they say, the Holy Prophet Muhammad did it, no mortal being can abolish it. Morally outraged by the child marriage, seeing it as legalized child abuse and rape justified by religious tradition. She tries to protest and intervene, but is met with religious and cultural justifications that leave her feeling powerless and deeply troubled. This experience further fuels her resolve to expose and challenge such practices through her activism and writing. The theme of child marriage is deeply woven into the novel's broader critique of gender oppression, religious justification, trauma, and the struggle for women's rights. Here's how child marriage ties into the novel's major themes. 1. Gender oppression and control. Child marriage is depicted as a tool of patriarchal control, used to restrict girls' autonomy and reinforce their subordination. The practice is justified by appeals to tradition and religious law, and girls are married off at a young age to ensure their obedience and sexual purity. Natasha's horror at the engagement of a 12-year-old girl to a much older cousin highlights how girls' bodies and futures are controlled by male authority figures and societal expectations. 2. Religious and cultural justification. The novel shows how child marriage is defended using religious texts and the example of the Prophet Muhammad's marriage to Aisha. When Natasha protests, she is met with the argument that the Sharia allows the father to give in marriage his 10-year-old daughter, and that the Prophet married Aisha at age 6 and consummated the marriage at 9. This religious justification is used to silence dissent and normalize the practice, tying child marriage to the broader theme of how religion is used to legitimize gender-based harm. 3. Silence, shame, and taboo. Natasha's attempts to intervene are met with resistance and silence. The mother of the child bride says she has no say in the matter, it is the father's decision. Natasha realizes the door of protesting was shut in her face and is left feeling powerless and deeply troubled. This reflects the broader culture of silence and taboo that surrounds not only child marriage, but also other abuses against women in the novel. 4. Trauma and moral outrage. Natasha's emotional response, her anger, frustration, and sense of moral outrage mirrors her reactions to other forms of gender-based violence in the novel, such as FGM and sexual assault. She sees child marriage as legalized rape in the name of religion and is disturbed by the normalization and defense of what she views as child abuse. 5. Resistance and activism. Although Natasha is unable to stop the marriage, the experience strengthens her resolve to expose and challenge such practices. It becomes part of her broader activism against misogynistic customs and laws, and fuels her determination to document and speak out against the abuses faced by women and girls. 6. The cycle of harm. The novel connects child marriage to other forms of harm, such as honor killings, FGM, and polygamy. All are presented as interconnected elements of a system that denies women and girls agency, education, and safety. Natasha's struggle to protect the child bride is emblematic of her larger fight against a web of patriarchal practices. In summary, child marriage in the novel is not just a single issue, it is a powerful symbol of the broader themes of gender oppression, religious justification, silence, trauma, and the urgent need for resistance and reform. Natasha's reaction to child marriage and her inability to prevent it highlight both the pervasiveness of these practices and the immense challenges faced by those who seek to challenge them. The theme of child marriage in Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society is deeply intertwined with other forms of gender oppression, such as female genital mutilation, FGM, polygamy, and honor-based violence, all of which are depicted as tools of patriarchal control. Natasha's horror at the engagement of a 12-year-old girl to a much older cousin echoes her outrage at witnessing FGM, as both practices are justified by appeals to religious tradition and are enforced to ensure girls' obedience, sexual purity, and conformity to societal expectations. The novel shows how these customs are defended using religious texts and the example of the Prophet Muhammad, and how questioning them is met with silence or hostility, effectively shutting down dissent and perpetuating harm. Natasha's inability to prevent either the child marriage or the FGM she witnesses highlights the pervasive culture of silence and taboo that surrounds women's suffering, as well as the lack of agency afforded to girls and women in these societies. Both child marriage and FGM are presented as interconnected elements of a broader system that denies women autonomy, education, and safety. And Natasha's outrage and activism against these practices become emblematic of her larger fight against the web of misogynistic customs and laws that shape the lives of women and girls. Natasha's views on marriage customs are deeply critical and reflective of her broader stance against patriarchal and oppressive traditions. Throughout her journey, Natasha is repeatedly confronted with marriage customs that she finds troubling, such as child marriage, polygamy, arranged marriages without the woman's consent, and the expectation of female submission. She is particularly disturbed by the normalization of child marriage, where young girls are married off to much older men, often justified by religious or cultural arguments. Natasha sees these practices as forms of legalized abuse and control over women's bodies and futures. She is also critical of polygamy, observing the jealousy, rivalry, and emotional suffering it causes among wives, as well as the confusion and neglect experienced by children in such households. Natasha notes that these customs are often enforced by both men and women, showing how patriarchal norms are internalized and perpetuated across generations. Natasha's reaction is not just one of personal discomfort. She actively questions, challenges, and debates these customs with those around her. She tries to intervene when she learns of a child marriage, voices her outrage at the justifications given for such practices, and documents the emotional and psychological toll these customs take on women and girls. Her experiences with these marriage customs fuel her activism and her determination to expose and challenge the broader system of gender oppression in the societies she studies. Several marriage customs are described in detail, illustrating the intersection of tradition, religion, and gender roles. Here are some notable examples from the text. 1. Arranged and child marriages. Girls are often married off at a young age, sometimes as young as 12, to much older male relatives. These marriages are arranged by the family, and the girl's consent is not considered necessary. The justification for such marriages is often rooted in religious tradition, with references to the Prophet Muhammad's marriage to Aisha. 2. Polygamy. The novel describes polygamous households where one husband has multiple wives, up to 4, as permitted by Islamic law. The wives live in a state of rivalry and competition for the husband's attention and resources. Their daily lives are marked by jealousy, conflict, and a lack of autonomy. 3. Wedding night rituals. There is a custom where, on the first wedding night, the bride is expected to resist the groom's advances, and the consummation of the marriage is often a physical struggle. The bride's resistance is seen as proof of her virtue and virginity, and the groom is expected to overcome her. This ritual is justified by tradition and is considered a test of both the bride's chastity and the groom's masculinity. Proof of virginity. After the wedding night, there is an expectation that the bride must provide physical evidence of her virginity, such as blood-stained sheets, to her family and in-laws. This custom reinforces the idea that a woman's worth is tied to her sexual purity. 5. Gender segregation in the home. The novel describes how traditional Muslim homes are divided into separate sections for men and women, with strict rules about movement and interaction. Women are not allowed to enter the men's section, and their activities are confined to the women's quarters. 6. Beauty and preparation rituals. Wives undergo elaborate and sometimes painful beauty rituals, such as hair removal and body smoking with sandalwood, to prepare themselves for their husband, especially on their designated nights. These rituals are seen as necessary to maintain the husband's interest and to compete with co-wives. These customs are not only described as cultural practices, but are also critically examined in the novel as mechanisms of gender oppression, shaping the lives and destinies of women and girls within the society. If you'd like, I can provide direct quotes that impact the characters, especially Natasha. Natasha's views on marriage customs are deeply critical and shaped by her experiences as both an outsider and a witness to the realities faced by women in Sudanese and broader Muslim societies. Natasha sees many of the marriage customs, such as arranged marriages, child marriages, polygamy, and the rituals surrounding the wedding night, as mechanisms of gender oppression. She is particularly disturbed by how these customs are justified through religious texts and cultural traditions, often without regard for the well-being or consent of women and girls. For example, Natasha is horrified by the normalization of child marriage and the expectation that girls must prove their virginity or submit to painful and humiliating rituals on their wedding night. She is also critical of polygamy, observing the rivalry, jealousy, and lack of autonomy experienced by co-wives, and the emotional harm inflicted on both women and children in such households. Throughout the novel, Natasha's reactions are marked by outrage, empathy, and a sense of moral responsibility. She attempts to challenge these customs, sometimes directly, by speaking out or trying to intervene, and sometimes indirectly, by documenting and exposing them in her research and activism. Natasha's experiences reinforce her belief that these marriage customs are not simply cultural practices, but are deeply embedded in systems of patriarchal control that deny women agency, dignity, and equality. Her critical perspective becomes a driving force in her transformation from a passive observer to an active advocate for women's rights. Here are specific quotes from Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed that illustrate Natasha's views on marriage customs. On child marriage and religious justification. Natasha became extremely mad with Shama. She understood that if she rejects the teaching of the Sharia, she might be accused of not being a true Muslim or an apostate girl. She ignored Shama and talked to Haja Fatima about this serious matter and tried to convince her to talk to the mother of the underage girl. Haja Fatima quoted for her the common story which Muslims always use to justify pedophilia. The Prophet Muhammad married our mother Aisha when she was 6-year-old and slept with her when she was 9-year-old. Natasha understood the door of protesting was shut in her face. This serious matter is so disturbing and torturing her conscience. More disturbing than the act of marrying and raping a child is the fact that Muslims today defend the practice of pedophilia and find the religious authority to back up their defense. Since, as they say, the Holy Prophet Muhammad did it, no mortal being can abolish it. On wedding night customs. How could rational and moral human beings whom God endowed with intellect and conscience allow such an evil practice in which an innocent girl had been brutally raped by a man, and they call it a good custom? She could not find any rational as well as moral justification for such an evil practice. Natasha considered that custom to be a justified and legalized rape in the name of religion. On polygamy and women's suffering. Through her close observation and growing friendship with the wives, Natasha gains first-hand insight into the consequences of polygamy, the confusion and neglect experienced by the children, the erosion of solidarity among women, and the normalization of jealousy and competition. She comes to see polygamy as a powerful tool of control and abuse, perpetuating the subjugation of women and undermining their well-being. On the broader system of oppression. Natasha's experiences with male family members underscore the broader themes of control, surveillance, and the struggle for autonomy that define her journey throughout the novel. These quotes show Natasha's critical, morally outraged, and activist stance toward marriage customs that perpetuate gender oppression, lack of consent, and the suffering of women and girls. If you need more quotes or want to focus on a particular custom, let me know. Marriage customs play a pivotal role in Natasha's character development, shaping her transformation from an outsider and observer into a determined activist and advocate for women's rights. At first, Natasha approaches Sudanese marriage customs, such as arranged marriages, child marriages, polygamy, and the rituals surrounding the wedding night, with a sense of curiosity and academic detachment. However, as she witnesses the real-life consequences of these customs on women and girls, her perspective shifts dramatically. For example, Natasha is horrified by the normalization of child marriage and the expectation that girls must submit to older men, often without their consent or understanding. She is equally disturbed by the ritualized violence and humiliation embedded in wedding night customs, where a bride's resistance is expected and the consummation is treated as a test of both her virtue and the groom's dominance. These experiences evoke in Natasha a deep sense of empathy and moral outrage. She moves from passive observation to active protest, attempting to intervene, questioning elders, and challenging the religious and cultural justifications offered for these practices. Natasha's frustration at being silenced or dismissed by those around her only strengthens her resolve. The repeated exposure to the suffering, trauma, and lack of agency experienced by women under these customs becomes a catalyst for her transformation. She channels her outrage into research, documentation, and ultimately, public advocacy, determined to expose and challenge the systems of gender oppression she encounters. Through her evolving response to marriage customs, Natasha's character arc illustrates a journey from vulnerability and confusion to resilience, agency, and leadership. The customs she witnesses do not merely inform her academic work. They become the driving force behind her activism and her commitment to fighting for the dignity and rights of women and girls. Religious justification plays a central role in shaping and perpetuating marriage customs, serving as both a shield and a tool for patriarchal control. Throughout the novel, characters frequently invoke religious texts, especially the Quran and Hadiths, to legitimize practices such as child marriage, polygamy, enforced virginity tests, and the expectation of female submission. For example, when Natasha protests the engagement of a 12-year-old girl to a much older cousin, she is met with the argument that the Sharia allows the father to give in marriage his 10-year-old daughter, and that the Prophet Muhammad married Aisha at age 6 and consummated the marriage at 9. These references are used to silence dissent and normalize practices that would otherwise be seen as abusive or unjust. Similarly, polygamy is justified by citing Quranic verses that permit a man to have up to 4 wives, and wedding night rituals are defended as traditions rooted in religious expectations of chastity and obedience. The novel shows that these justifications are not only invoked by men, but are also internalized and repeated by women, who may feel powerless to challenge religious authority even when they recognize the harm caused by these customs. Natasha's attempts to question or resist these practices are often dismissed as ignorance or even apostasy, highlighting how religious justification is used to enforce conformity and suppress critical voices. The novel critiques this dynamic by showing how appeals to religion can be manipulated to maintain patriarchal power, making it extremely difficult for individuals, especially women, to advocate for change or assert their rights. In summary, religious justification in the novel is depicted as a powerful force that upholds and perpetuates marriage customs, reinforcing gender hierarchies and limiting the agency of women and girls. Natasha's struggle to challenge these justifications underscores the broader theme of resistance against systems that use faith as a means of control. In the novel Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed, the phrase culture of shame is used to describe the pervasive social environment in which honor, reputation, and the avoidance of disgrace are prioritized above individual well-being, especially for women and girls. This culture is deeply embedded in the customs, laws, and daily life of the society depicted in the novel. The culture of shame manifests in several ways. Control of female sexuality. Practices like female genital mutilation, FGM, child marriage, and enforced virginity tests are justified as necessary to protect family honor and prevent shame. Girls are taught from a young age that their bodies and behavior can bring disgrace upon their families. Silencing victims. Victims of sexual violence, forced marriage, or other abuses are often pressured to remain silent to avoid bringing shame to their families. Natasha herself experiences this when she is discouraged from reporting abuse or challenging harmful customs. Social exclusion. Women and girls who are perceived to have violated social norms, such as being born out of wedlock, refusing an arranged marriage, or being victims of rape, are often ostracized or even subjected to violence in the name of restoring honor. Justification of harmful practices. The culture of shame is used to justify and perpetuate harmful traditions, making it difficult for individuals like Natasha to challenge or change them. Even those who recognize the harm may feel powerless to act for fear of social repercussions. By highlighting the culture of shame, the novel critiques how collective fear of disgrace is weaponized to control women, enforce conformity, and silence dissent. It shows that true change requires not only legal reform, but also a transformation of the underlying values that sustain cycles of silence and oppression.